She wiped the dust from the lamp, set the tray down, and pushed the door open with a practiced foot. Room 1207 smelled faintly of lemon and machine polish, the curtains drawn tight against the late afternoon sun. The billionaire's suite had been left immaculate. Crystal glasses, a leather-bound journal on the nightstand, a pair of slippers aligned perfectly by the bed. Maria had cleaned this corridor for 5 years. She knew the rhythm of other people's lives by the little things they left behind. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Then she saw him, pale, motionless, draped across the chaise lounge like a man who had simply fallen asleep. His suit was still tailored, his watch glinting. A magazine lay open near his hand. Maria's chest tightened. Instincts she couldn't explain told her something was wrong. She stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything. "Sir." Her voice was small in the cavernous room. No answer. She reached for his wrist. Cold. No pulse. She dropped to her knees, breath shallow, brain racing through 1,000 practical rules she'd been taught. Call security, call the manager, do not touch anything. Instead, she found herself doing something else. Years of scrubbing stains and making beds had taught Maria how to see people. She saw the faint cascade of pills on the nightstand, a glass with lipstick on its rim, smudged fingerprints on the marble sink. She noticed the smell of antiseptic and something sweeter, an almond tang that made her stomach lurch. Heart pounding, she stood and backed away slowly, not wanting to change the scene. She did as she had been trained and pressed the emergency button on her cart. The red light flashed. Within minutes, footsteps thundered on the carpet, hotel security, and then Mr. Thompson, the general manager, his face folding into a mask of forced composure. The police tape followed, questions, cameras. Maria clutched her apron as if it were armor. They asked her to wait in the staff room. A dozen times she wanted to tell them everything she had seen, every small detail, the way the pages of the journal had been bent, the position of the magazine, the faint bruise at the corner of his mouth. But the officers spoke in clipped sentences, and their notebooks were heavy with assumptions. Accidents, maybe an overdose, perhaps he had been sick. They led witnesses through the same choreography. The maid's testimony, the manager's statement, a photograph cataloged and tagged. Maria felt the truth drawing taut inside her like a string. She had cleaned that room 3 days earlier and had noticed a different man. This billionaire, Alejandro Vance, lived with a small retinue of aides and a steady rotation of guests. But the chaise lounge was new, she remembered, and a postcard from a town in Vermont she'd never heard of. She wanted to tell them about the postcard, about the small inscription on the back. For new beginnings, They moved on before she could explain why such a scrap mattered. Days passed. The press sniffed the story like hungry dogs. Billionaire found dead, possible suicide, guests unsettled. Maria kept returning to the image of his hand curled, as if it had clutched something invisible. She could not sleep. At night, she would open the small locket around her neck, her mother's, warm from years of touching, and feel the hollow ache of secrets pressing at the edges of her life. Then, 2 nights after the death, a man came looking for her. He wore a suit that had seen better tailoring, but held himself like a man used to being noticed. His name was Julian Hart, private investigator, he said, with a polite smile and a voice that carried curiosity. He told her quietly that Alejandro Vance's family had retained his services because some things didn't fit the neat narrative the police were moving toward. Maria hesitated. She had promised herself she would not speak beyond what she had already said. But something about the way Julian looked at her, not as a maid, but as a person who might hold a missing piece, loosened her reserve. They sat in her favorite diner booth, the neon humming over their heads, and she told him everything she had seen, even the postcard, the bruise, the almond scent. Julian listened like a man taking inventory. When she mentioned the postcard, his eyes sharpened. "Vermont," he murmured. "A small town? The handwriting." Maria nodded. Maybe a lover, she offered weakly. He didn't smile. Or a meeting. Or a message. He handed her a card with a number and asked her to call if anything else occurred. That night, Maria dreamed of the billionaire alive, laughing at some private joke, the corner of the chaise lounge catching sunlight. She woke at 3 in the morning with a sudden certainty and went to the laundry room, to the smallest of company secrets, the lost and found. Over the years, she had learned that guests misplace more than umbrellas. Letters, cufflinks, that peculiar confidence between husbands and mistresses, and that items returned rarely found their way back to ownerless bins. She took a flashlight and went through the lost items with hands that trembled. It was, she told herself, petty and perhaps foolish. But among the monogrammed scarves and discarded sunglasses, she found a thin envelope, the flap torn, addressed in a careful hand. To A, inside, a pressed sprig of lavender and a single photograph folded in half. The photograph had been taken in a small kitchen, a woman with a freckled nose and a ready smile, a man with Alejandro's familiar jaw, their arms loose around each other. On the back, in ink, a date and a note, beginning July 12th. Do not forget. Maria held the paper as if it might burn her fingers. This was proof of something, a connection Alejandro had kept hidden. She took the photograph to Julian. Together, they traced the address on the postcard, phoned the Vermont bed and breakfast from the message, and were told that Alejandro had stayed there 2 months earlier but not alone. The innkeeper hesitated before confirming the name of a woman who had shared his room for 3 days. Julian's jaw tightened. The police had called the death an accident. Julian wanted to know why Alejandro had traveled hundreds of miles to that town to see someone. Days turned into a quiet investigation. Maria found herself swept into a world she had only seen from the periphery. Lawyers with polished smiles, aides who guarded schedules like treasure maps, and a daughter who arrived from Europe with a face like an accusation. Each person seemed to hold a different portrait of Alejandro, the titan, the flawed father, the secret lover. But the thing they could not explain was the almond scent that lingered on his hand, the bruise, the way his fingers had curled. Julian ran background checks, following small threads. A supplier who claimed a delivery the night before, a bartender who remembered him laughing with an unknown woman, a receipt for a rare almond brittle ordered to the suite. The police were efficient but bound to procedures. Julian's methods were messy and humane. He wanted to know who had the most to gain from Alejandro's silence and who had the most reason to keep secrets. Meanwhile, Maria kept doing the work she knew, linens, rooms, smiles, and carried the photograph in her pocket like contraband. She talked to other maids, to the bellman who had once seen Alejandro argue with a man on the phone, to the concierge who mentioned a name he'd heard. R. Scott. Nothing was decisive, but each fragment felt like a pulse in a body someone had tried to smooth over. On the 10th day, a janitor found traces of a substance behind the minibar, nearly invisible, a residue that smelled like the same almond. It was enough to reopen the case. The lab tests were deliberate and slow, and when the results came back, the words were clinical: cyanide. The hotel shuddered. The headlines changed tone: homicide. Security cameras were revisited frame by frame. For Maria, it was like the room had exhaled a secret. She remembered the way Alejandro's glass had been set aside, the lipstick, the bent page of a book about ordinary saints. Someone had made him believe the drink was safe, that the end would be elegant. Someone had intended no messy scene. But why? Was it business? Was it personal? The question sharpened into obsession. Julian combed the billionaire's recent correspondence and found a pattern of denied loans and a company on the brink. The daughter, who had returned from Europe, had been cut out of a will. A supplier's claim sounded like blackmail disguised as financial pressure. Alejandro had enemies, but enemies do not always move like lovers. Then Maria remembered the bruise at the corner of his mouth. She had thought it a small abrasion. She asked Julian to bring the photograph to the lab to test for DNA on the pressed lavender. It was an odd request, but the lab obliged. The DNA matched a woman named Rachel Emerson, a name that led them to Vermont and to a house with peeling paint and a garden overrun with lavender. Rachel answered the door in bare feet, hair in a braid, and the photograph fell from Maria's hand like proof that had been waiting. She did not flee or deny. Instead, she invited them inside, where photographs lined the walls. Alejandro laughing in a boat, Alejandro arguing with a man whose face was partly shadowed, Alejandro and Rachel at a hospital bedside. We were planning to leave, Rachel said, her voice calm. We were starting over. She showed them letters in which Alejandro promised to sell his shares, to step away from family power for the sake of a quiet life. But the letters also revealed another pressure: threats, invoices from numbered accounts, men who had no names. Alejandro was a man with one foot in two worlds, and someone had decided that the easier path was to make him disappear. The arrest came like a small, bitter bloom. A procurement officer who had lost a lucrative contract to Alejandro's changes was taken in on charges of conspiracy, and later a contractor with ties to offshore accounts confessed to meeting with a fixer who obtained cyanide. The daughter watched as lawyers arranged settlements and as cameras circled like vultures. In the aftermath, Maria found herself both shaken and strangely unburdened. The hotel returned to its old rhythms, but room 1207 was different. An empty shell with the memory of a man who had tried to remake his life and paid with it. The family released a statement thanking the hotel for its staff's swift action, and Maria's name surfaced in articles that called her a hero, a simple hotel maid who had the courage to speak. But the truth was quieter. Maria had not set out to be a hero. She had simply followed the insistence inside her that small things mattered: a postcard, a sprig of lavender, a bent photograph. Those tiny witnesses had threaded into a story that pulled back a corner on power and secrecy. On her last night before a week off, Maria stood outside room 1207 and ran her palm across the door's cool surface. She thought of Alejandro's laughter in those photographs and the way the lavender smelled like summers she had never had. She touched the locket at her throat and whispered, not for the cameras or the headlines, but for the absent man's notebook on the nightstand, for the second chances people chase when the world defines them only by the sum of their fortunes. Rest, she said, meaning both a wish and a benediction. Then she turned and walked away, the corridor swallowing her small, steady footsteps. She carried a calm certainty that truth begins with noticing small things, anew,